What is the single biggest mistake we're making in how we grow food today?
The question isn't, can we make enough food? But I think it's, can we make the right food? We spend more to treat these three chronic categories of disease than we do all of the food we all eat combined.
How far along are we on the curve of AI here?
Gene editing is becoming such a rich tool. In the next 5 to 10 years, the innovations in AI-oriented will actually outpace human medicine.
Like the YouTube moment of agriculture.
I think it's actually a good analogy. Nobody cares if you kill plants.
So why is it not happening faster?
So you have an oligopoly at the seed level. It's very difficult to shift. The plant-based movement was dropping. We saw our margin compression just shatter.
How do we square this with the growing movement, natural, organic?
There are well-funded campaigns paying extremists to dig up crops that help cure blind children.
You're saying maybe we're gonna get the next Jeff Bezos, who doesn't make space his big project focus, but decides to just go and absolutely disrupt agriculture. Welcome back to Accelerate Bio. Hi, Matt. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay. What is the single biggest mistake we're making in how we grow food today?
If you hear from people in pitches a lot of the time, we need to feed so many billion people by the year 2050, 2060, what have you. I think the premise is that we're not very great at growing crops, right? And that's the biggest misnomer, is that we actually globally already produce plenty of calories to feed everybody in the entire world. The question isn't, can we make enough food? But I think it's, can we make the right food? And when people talk about food security, I think people need to be thinking more so about nutrition security. And so when we think about like, what can we do to grow crops better? It's growing the crops that provide better balanced nutrition, which leads to better health outcomes, which leads to better societal outcomes, education outcomes, quality outcomes. And so I think that it's about a quality over quantity question that we really don't talk a whole lot about.
Quality over quantity, that makes sense. What do we mean by better nutritional values, though, and how do we conceptualize this?
Yeah, I mean, in the United States, for 70 plus years, we've become really amazingly terrific at efficiency, producing a lot with a little. And some people would say we're the best in the world at producing cheap calories, and we really are. But when we think about what do we really need, it isn't just the cheap calories, right? The center aisle carbohydrates, but where is the fiber? Where is the protein density? Where is the balanced protein that our bodies need from an essential amino acid standpoint? I mean, crops and agriculture are the currency of all of these things, and not all of them are grown on millions and millions of acres, and monocultures are grown in vegetables and fruits and other areas of the United States than just the Midwest. And I'm only talking about the Midwest, obviously, but I mean this globally. And so, yeah, it's about obtaining through what we can grow, and also, animal agriculture, a diversity that, I think we, due to scale desires, have gotten away from, maybe a little too much, overshot it a bit in the last, 20, 30 years or more. But I think that that's lent itself to some pretty horrible health outcomes as well.
There is definitely a lot of agreement on that. How much consensus is there on what constitutes the right diet or the right balance of crops? There is definitely a lot of, I don't know if it's hype, but yeah, a lot of agreement, a lot of leaning towards high protein right now. But then there are a lot of trends which are pretty volatile about soy proteins versus carnivore, which is more trending now. So,
right.
Yeah, how much consensus is there?
Well, I don't think there's any consensus, that's for sure. I'm a big soy fan because soy I consider to be the only most widely grown whole protein. Meaning it has all the essential amino acids. It has a PDCAS, of nearly one, which is sort of a surrogate indicator for having all of the essential amino acids like eggs or animal protein would in your ordinary diet. Um, there's poor proteins too, though. I mean, there's proteins like people, have all this craze and rage and love for almond milk, which I think is nonsensical. Almond milk is just like white water, horrible for the environment, has very, very little nutritional value. And so, I think to find, a consensus in any of it is impossible. But I think we're maybe from an awareness standpoint, I noticed in agriculture, making some strides in the right direction. I mean, we know that, whatever, 50s, 80 years ago, maybe smoking cigarettes was in vogue. It was very common. It was very popular. I sometimes say, sugar is the tobacco of the 21st century. All right. We're beginning to understand more clearly that like eating a lot of sugar is very bad for you. And sugar happens to come along as a delivery vehicle for a lot of stuff, that's cheap to produce. And so getting away from the stuff that's cheap to produce oftentimes has these secondary and tertiary benefits where we get rid also of junk, that comes along. And that's what I meant when I said center aisle, right? I mean, you've got all kinds of stuff that gets added to these carbohydrates and other things that make us and our bellies, which speak, as part of our brain, it speaks to, I want more of that. And as soon as we eat it, we want more of it. And that's our biology speaking, but that's just because our bodies are ancient and they're in survival mode to, you find a berry on a tree, you want to eat all the berries, right? But that's not necessarily, the scarcity system in which we live today.
So you talk about adding things, and there's definitely a lot of awareness about, fewer additives and less processed food right now. But that happens after the harvest. So how does this translate to the crops we grow in the field?
Right. Well, think about it like this. When you grow tomatoes in your garden, right, and you taste those, oftentimes you find that they might taste just more flavorful, more wholesome, more rich with, I mean, sugars, natural sugars, but other flavonoids and secondary metabolites that are really the product of having bred, amazingly delicious fruits and veg. When you have an agriculture system, though, that needs to produce things at mass scale, oftentimes those delicious flavors or those enhancements that you might enjoy at your farmer's market, they get left behind because we need to put it on a boat or on a truck and we need to ship it, hundreds or thousands of miles. And so I think it all starts with the ground in which we grow the plant. And so if you have an agriculture system that would prioritize nutrition, but also the things we love and adore, like taste and flavor, that's always the number one thing we choose to eat, right, then you can avoid a lot of the crap that has to be added to it later on. And so the idea here, of course, is that, breeding and genetics, I think of it like the software, right, of the entire system. And if we have the right genetics within the crops and foods and vegetables, what have you, that we eat, and we're willing to tailor that more to our desire and our nutritional needs, then it becomes less important to add that stuff later that's hyper processed or whatever.
Fair enough. So if we were to design our food system today from scratch to optimize for what you just described, the nutrition and flavor, what would it look like and what would we do different?
Well, that's a big question. I couldn't tell you there's a design. I think it's going to be more about, in parts and pieces, undoing the commodity system that we've established and essentially decommoditizing pieces of the system. And in order to do that, I think you need a cooperation in effect across the value chain. You can't have 2, 3, 5 crops that constitute 95% of agriculture volume, controlled by 3 or 4 integrators, that ship that effectively into the broader food system. I think you have to have the end user, us, the consumer, ultimately, telling the people from whom we're buying these groceries and these food goods that we demand something better or different from the system. And we're willing to pay for it. Maybe we're not willing to pay drastically more, but the demand side, I think, is sort of the tail that wags the dog here. And you're seeing some elements of that. There's some of these CPGs that are being more thoughtful about organizing their efforts to regenerative farming practices, to nutritional density, in some cases organic even, but creating, what we in agriculture call closed loop supply, like closed loop systems, where they're contracting with a farmer who is very eager, by the way, to create value added opportunities for the end user. He or she is willing to grow something different, to experiment with other crops in order not just necessarily to be paid for, the Chicago Board of Trade price of soybeans or corn, but if they grew something that was more specialty, that's an opportunity. And I think the digitization of that chain and the communication up and down the chain is becoming more enabled today than it's ever been. But it's frustratingly slow. I mean, to be honest, I wish that, I wish that there was more foresight and thought and incentive, frankly, especially from healthcare and insurance providers, to shift that paradigm maybe more aggressively than it is today.
So this is really interesting. You're talking about the commoditization of crops and more choice. And so this is probably a terrible metaphor, but what comes to my mind is like the YouTube moment of agriculture. Like prior to this, you had a couple of national carriers. Everybody was taking their news from one of those. And now you have a lot of different people who can have different channels. And It's much more personalized what you consume. So Are we talking about that kind of shift?
I think so. I think it's actually a good analogy, really. I think when you think about the long tail of it, so take more of the area that I'm familiar with, which is crop genetics. In order to breed a better crop, 20 years ago, this is a multi-million-dollar, many year effort just to breed one new variety of something. And the priority has always been, and frankly still continues to be in the major seed companies, one thing: yield. That's it. More. And with yield, oftentimes you see over time the quality decreasing. In fact, there's charts that the USDA has published, and yield goes up over time like this, and nutrition density goes down. It's an inverse relationship because it's easier to breed for carbohydrates and cheap calories, and that's what farmers get paid for, right? But if you say, okay, what if I undo that? And what if I begin to incentivize for the things that the end user actually wants? Am I able to evolve, the system to decommoditize some of these things, create, structures, incentive structures that allow for the farmer to, on a contract basis, grow something that's more desired by the end user? I just think that's where we ought to go. I think that's where things will be going.
By the way, if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We drop a new episode weekly, exploring how AI, biotech, and human enhancement are shaping the future. And if a friend would love this too, send it their way. It really helps us keep going. Now back to the pod.
Let me go back. So to your long tail point, what I'm trying to say there is the genetics, because over time, it's become so much cheaper to create those varieties. Now you have, what will become a long tail. To create a new variety of something using gene editing or CRISPR technology, years ago would have been millions, even tens of millions of dollars, frankly. Today you can do it for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so again, I'm going back up the value chain to where I was describing, I'm familiar with, that's like now instead of needing a tomato that just yields 2 or 5% more, I can say, well, I can, for the same amount of money, create a tomato that's got some unique consumer-oriented characteristic that they would like to see, and therefore, maybe you get the YouTubers and the TikTokers and the equivalent of molecular biologists, out there, creating novel crop varieties that they can go sell to their farmers markets. I think it could be really cool, but again, that's like looking out into the future of how biology enables this paradigm shift.
So I definitely want to double click on the technology here. But first, so you said the tech is there. You said the consumer demand is there. In many cases, they're willing to pay, but the industry is slow to adapt. So what are the bottlenecks here, and why is it not happening faster?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, in agriculture, the same things that made us the best in the world at efficiency are the very things that forcefully keep us out of this long tail, to keep using your term. So you have an oligopoly at the seed level. You can count on one hand the number of seed companies that control the significant majority of seed genetics for crops that are grown that we eat. You have an oligopoly at the next level of the value chain beyond the farmer. We call them integrators. So like ABCD is often used, ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Louis Dreyfus. So these are massive traders, essentially, that consolidate the grain. They distribute it, into the next rung of the food value chain. And there is where, you see the CPGs and the retail and the grocery and what have you. So that dual level oligopolistic paradigm is very difficult to shift. There's very, very, very little incentive to see those kinds of organizations, peeling off minuscule amounts of their supply chain, for these what are considered very niche opportunities. There's some of them that do it at a micro scale relative to their larger businesses, but that's what we're up against, really. And that's where I think more simple supply chains are easier to institute this change, where maybe you're not processing a food good, but you're just packing and shipping it. So, again, think vegetables. Vegetable is contract to be grown with a farmer. A grower, packer, shipper would procure that. They distribute it into pick your local favorite grocery store. Like, that's a much simpler way to move through across the food value chain and institute some degree of change. But it's also incredibly niche. So once again, you have to see this cost of innovation go down in order to enable that model, even if it's, very localized.
Do you think this oligopoly is just going to erode bit by bit over time? Or is there a potential to have like a big bang moment, some big catalyst when this will just suddenly change?
It's an awesome question. I hate to be such a pessimist, but I'm not optimistic that there's some big bang moment catalyst. But if there were one, or one maybe that begins to look like one, I actually think it's the healthcare system. In the United States, we spend around, I've lost track of the numbers, I think it's $2-ish trillion just on like 3 or so diseases, chronic diseases like diabetes, that are caused by food. And we spend like 1.8 trillion on food, like all in. So we spend more to treat these 3 chronic categories of disease than we do all of the food we all eat combined. I think it's like, what? Like, that makes what? So I think if there is a shapeshift moment, I think it's got to be instituted by the system that is paying an exorbitant amount to take care of people who haven't eaten the way that, we might have should or we should have, right? That's, yeah. Who pays for that is the question, right? Is it the insurer? Is it, does the healthcare, the system start to break down, when, you see subsidies, as seems to be the case lately, are going to collapse for people's healthcare insurance. I buy my healthcare, so I don't get benefits from like a company. So I buy my healthcare from, like a government portal, right? And so I got a notice and it says my healthcare premium that I pay is going to go up over 100% next year. And I've talked to some people that said it's like theirs is going up like 180%, like, which is almost 3 times what they were going to pay, right? I mean, there's a lot of people. I'm very fortunate that I can afford to pay what I think is ridiculous increase, but there's a lot of people who can't afford to pay 2 or 3 times what they're paying for healthcare insurance right now, with not even terrific coverage, frankly. And so, is that going to eventually break? I don't know, but it seems to be a much harder question to answer than, do I choose this variety versus this variety of strawberries?
There would be definitely an interesting scenario if some of those healthcare dollars could get allocated towards just better food production.
Yeah. I talked to a friend of mine not long ago, and their insurance company has shipped them a scale. So every morning they get on the scale, and if they get on the scale every morning, they get and they maintain certain health and BMI or weight and BMI and what have you. They're getting like a 12 or 15% discount on their health insurance, and it's a live feed, to the insurance company. And so I think these things, wearables, right? These kinds of things they aid us for people who care about it, but I think they're also going to begin to aid the system, and those data are going to become more and more important.
Okay, so that's the top-down scenario. Something is breaking in the healthcare system, and okay, we're waking up. Maybe it's going to happen. We realize we need to fix this. And then on the other side, we have got the bottom up, which is the tech itself becoming mature and just enabling us to do things that we were not able to do before. So let's talk about that for a minute. You mentioned genetic modification and growing new types of crops. So can you maybe just give us like a high-level overview of where the tech is and what is like the revolution that's being enabled now?
There's a few layers of this. So in agriculture, you've got the inputs that the farmer uses. So the big inputs that a farmer uses are the seed, which are really just the seed is the delivery vehicle for the genetics, of course, that grow the crop. Fertilizer, that's a massive and costly input. And then the chemistries and the other technologies that are put down on the crop that either usually will protect it from pests like insects, fungal pathogens, or weeds. And sometimes those chemistries and biologies will also help, from a growth enhancement perspective or growth stimulant perspective, which is a smaller piece of the market. But those are the 3 kind of big categories. I think technologies right now touching each one of them pretty meaningfully. It's no surprise that genetic modification in the crops is a massive lever. You have breeding, which in my last company, I think we were the first that I know of to build, a truly enabled digital twin technology that would allow us to do very, very rapid cycle breeding for nutrition density enhancements, and where we could actually model out many, many generations and then create crosses inside. So breed inside and then have something that we had 90+% confidence that when we took it to the field, it would be a commercially viable crop. That's a massive breakthrough. But even outside of that, within crop genetics, you have gene editing, you have GMO technology, which is essentially taking an exogenous gene and putting it in for some effect. which we need to do less and less of, I think, because gene editing is becoming such a rich tool, and it's much faster and cheaper and more thoughtfully regulated in some respects. Not in Europe for sure, but and then in the fertilizer space, you've got companies that are creating microbial based solutions that enhance nitrogen more efficiently. That you have a friend of mine works with a company that's in the phosphorus and phosphate, and I couldn't explain exactly how it works, but it limits runoff, and you don't have this sort of secondary negative effect on the environment. That's all technology enabled. On the crop protection side, I'm actually really excited. I'm a part of another company right now that is using a totally AI design platform that we license from human medicine to create bespoke small proteins that can be used in crop protection. So custom designed mini proteins or biologicals that can attack, fungal pathogens or weeds or insect pests, but they can do it with the same degree of efficiency and cost and efficacy that a chemical can, right? A chemical that, in the past has been, the subject of a lot of debate, heavily regulated, a lot of lawsuits, like with glyphosate now these days, et cetera. So, that's the top part of the value chain. And I think those three big inputs are already tech, biotech and tech enabled. But as you sort of trickle down through, what I think becomes more tech oriented is the digitization of the channel itself. So creating more efficient handoffs in between the farmer and the off-taker at the integrator level and the CPG or the ingredient company. So that transparency up and down the value chain using blockchain and other technologies, sort of enabling some of this closed loop identity preservation oriented systems. It's creating the monetization opportunity for carbon sequestration, regenerative agriculture, which is predominantly no-till and cover cropping. So tech is sort of on both, two or three axes, I think, through the system. Some of it bio and some of it a little bit more traditional tech.
So you mentioned gene editing, you mentioned AI, you mentioned digitization, which is a pretty exciting tech stack, I guess. My question would be, what is a good example of something that has made it to the table over the past decade or so based on these technologies that's really made a difference already?
So I'm going to point to a great case study from a former company I worked with in soy, actually, where I mentioned that we were doing this digital twin technology so that we could understand how to breed for nutrition density.
That's Benson Hill, right?
Yeah, that's Benson Hill, right? And one of the other things that we bred for was the introgression of the reduction of certain anti-nutrients, which cause like gut inflammation, specifically not just in some humans, but in fish. So aquaculture, a really cool market, was very interested in this technology. And how it was enabled was we were able to develop soybeans with very, very high protein content that did not have these certain gut inflammatory anti-nutrients. And we were contracting it with farmers, 50,000, 80,000 plus acres of production. Then we were processing it. And by processing, we mean crushing. So just separating the oil from the meal. And the meal is principally protein and carbohydrate. And then we were shipping that meal over to Norway. And they were essentially feeding it directly to the fish. The reason that was really, really innovative is this. Usually, that product that the fish would be fed as part of their ration would be called a soy concentrate, right? And so a concentrate will do the exact same thing at first. You'll separate the oil and you'll have the meal, but then you have to go through another processing step, which is extremely energy intensive, water intensive, carbon intensive. And then and only then do you get this protein concentration in the meal, which is like 60, 65, 70%, right? where if you produce the high enough protein bean to begin with, you disintermediate that entire step, the whole thing. So you're able to offer a customer at massive scale. I mean, we were shipping Panamax boats of this stuff to Norway, right? At massive scale, I can sell it to that guy for 10, 20% less than he's paying for essentially the exact same thing. And I saved, 50 to 90% water. I saved, 40 to 60% carbon emissions. I provided a grower an opportunity to make more money from what they previously would have just made as a commodity. And I still had margin left in the middle. And so that's a perfect example of like biotechnology and breeding in that case, really coming to life. But you had to integrate the supply chain in order to enable the opportunity to happen on the farm, right?
Interesting. So I would love to maybe double click on Benson Hill here as a case study. For those who don't know, I believe you spent over a decade and a half building this company. You took it public in 2021, 1 billion plus valuation. So that's a great success. However, Benson Hill is now no more. So what happened here, and what are like the biggest learnings that apply to agriculture technology or Agtech overall?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think there's a few. I mean, you're right. I founded Benson Hill in 2012. We went public in 2021, and I left within a couple years after. And I'd say the biggest lesson that we learned is that we essentially underwrote the public offering on the back of the plant-based protein movement. So that exact same process I just described to you with essentially a surrogate soy concentrate and disintermediating that supply step, that was an extraordinarily valuable proposition to human plant-based protein consumers. So think like the Impossible Foods of the world and the Kellogg Morning Stars of the world. They're also buying this protein concentrate for which, we predicted, and, a lot of analysts were predicting, a 70 to 90% under capacity situation, given the growth rate of the alt plant movement, alt protein movement. And that was, of course, right in the middle of the pandemic, right? And so we saw this amazing CAGR. We saw, we're going to run out of soy concentrate capacity. The prices at that point had already doubled for soy concentrate, given the growth demand. And so we were perfectly positioned, to basically go in and say, how can we, using this technology, enable the entire supply chain to create something using its existing infrastructure that it doesn't have to go build for $500 million every additional plant. And so, you are using effectively, again, to use my biology software example, you're using like this improved software to run on the existing hardware that, drastically improve the efficiency and the value creation opportunity of the system. And so when we did that, we underwrote the public offering. We made 2 acquisitions that gave us some of that capacity to move product to the end users, like to those aqua people. And then within a year and a half of us actually getting out, the market just took a U-turn. I mean, the plant-based movement wasn't just flattened. It was dropping. You saw a steep reduction in consumer volume. You saw China dumping cheap protein into the U.S. market. So those prices that had doubled were now half or even less than half of what they were. So we saw our margin compression just shatter. And then at the exact same time, we also saw, the interest rate environment go from essentially zero to something much, much greater than zero. And so we had this sort of perfect storm of macro issues, some of which were ag and some of which were not ag, come into play. And to be honest, at that point, it's more about like how quickly can you pivot the model? How quickly can you move into another category, another value prop? And, I wasn't there to actually attempt to change, but, it was I think it became a futile effort. The longer you waited, the harder it becomes to turn that ship. And it's harder to turn that ship as a public company, so I'll give that credit. But when you're private, that would be a 3 to 6 month thing, and in a public company, given numerous dynamics, it ended up being way too long to make that shift. And so the company more or less just went pear-shaped. And I'm sad to say, a couple of years after I left, just to watch it disintegrate. But there's a lot of lessons in that while I was there. I'm sure there's a lot since I left too, but it was painful to watch, I'll tell you that.
Well, that's entrepreneurship. I think Beyond Meat is another interesting case study here. At one point in 2021, it was kind of everywhere. The stock was super hot, and now it's really down. It's really barely hanging on, right? I wonder, does that bring us back to the conversation about the volatility in consumer preferences that's just making this really, really hard?
Yeah. I mean, you talking about Beyond Meat in particular?
I mean, just as an example of this, but yeah. I'm sure there are others.
Well, I mean, I'd tell you that I think Beyond Meat has the deck stacked even more against it, frankly. So I'm a huge fan of yellow pea. That was the secondary crop that we worked on for a while at Benson Hill, and it doesn't have that whole PDCAS of 1, but pretty darn good, which is why you would see many companies mixing pea protein with rice protein, because rice protein would bring along the lysine that the yellow pea protein was lacking. But yellow pea is just really much more expensive than soy. So you have an inferior nutritional product. You've got a much more expensive product, one that's also much more subject to pricing volatility because it's grown in a smaller area. And so environmental conditions change. You can see the price of yellow pea bounce around quite a bit. And so it's a shame, Beyond Meat, you sort of had backed continuously into this corner. But, with the debt load that they issued when they were, like you said, soaring in the hundreds and 200s per share, that debt came due too. And so now I don't know the degree of recap, but I mean, like you said, I don't even know if they're still hanging on or if they're just sort of, gliding along the bottom, the very, very bottom. But anyway.
Are there actually two opposing forces here? So you mentioned in the beginning that consumer preferences are shifting to more variety and so much larger quantity of much more niche products. But in order to make any of these new types of food successful, whether it's Beyond Meat or whether it's the stuff that Benson Hill was working on, you really need economies of scale, right? So are those two things kind of in contradiction?
Well, 100%. You're exactly right. That is the diametric opposing force that keeps the vast majority of these kinds of innovations off the market, to be honest. And this wasn't. Some people don't think that this was a popular move or the right move. I'll continue to defend it, but it was very unorthodox for a company like Benson Hill to go to acquire crush capacity. I mean, people are like, well, why would you do that? But at the same time, go try to have that conversation with Bunge, the largest soy crusher in the world, and see if you're going to get them to turn off, 3,000 ton per day processing plant so that piddly old you can come along and flow a few truckfuls of stuff through there. This is never going to happen. You can forget about it. And so somebody has to access the end market. I can't get a customer in an ingredient company or an aquaculture feed company or a CPG if I can't deliver them product. I can beg and borrow and plead with a Bunge all day, but you're right, that opposing force of scale will never allow me to become a priority until I have scale. And you can't get scale until you have a customer. And so you have to go get customers in order to demand more from the system. And so that shift worked, actually, in some cases. You fed the end market with a value and a value proposition that was meaningful. They come back into the channel and then on a regional or what have you basis, they demand that product. And if you had seen companies like Pilgrims or Tyson or Sanderson Farms do this in poultry, which they're frankly insane not to be doing. I think they're squandering shareholder value by not making a shift like this and demanding this kind of product from the value chain as it is today. Frankly, I think it's irresponsible. But if they don't, then that those integrators are never going to shift. They're never going to contract those acres. They're never going to grow those genetics, and they're never going to establish that scale that you're describing.
So you're talking about vertical integration in the case of Benson Hill here as basically the only way to go to market. That sounds tough, as you pointed out. Would you have done any of that different the next time? Or like, is there a way for somebody else trying to build something in this space to just use a different model and be successful?
It's a great question. I wouldn't have done anything different as it related to the soy business, because we knew that we had the genetics that were differentiated enough in order to catalyze the demand side. What is not really remembered, because fortunately we were able to get out of this business, it was a mistake, was we also at one point were vertically integrated in the grower, packer, shipper level. So remember me talking about how that value chain is much more simplified. The reason why it was a mistake is that we didn't have the killer app, right? I didn't have the green pepper or the tomato or the cantaloupe that had a validated value proposition that was going to pay for my channel establishment. We did it with the expectation that we would have the genetic improvements in order to move those more specialized crops. And frankly, to do so in a more simplified value chain would have been less hard to execute. But, we worked on that project for over 2 years, and it just turned into, frankly, a massive headache. It generated a lot of revenue and a minuscule amount of cash flow, but the proverbial juice was not worth the squeeze. And it ended up being a failure, and I'm glad that we got out of it. But that was definitely a big distraction that we embarked on before we went public, but we didn't get out of it until we were public.
What is the upcoming killer app that you are the most excited about? You're involved in a bunch of different Agtech companies right now.
One, I would say from an app perspective, a company that I'm involved in called iCore Agriculture has the first new mode of action in fungicides that I think is in decades. We've tested it in more than 10 crops and just as many geographies: North America, South America, soy, corn, wheat, fill in the blank. And it works remarkably well against a huge variety of really terrible fungal pathogens that destroy a lot of crops. And a lot of the fungicides that are out there today are failing, frankly, or they're developing, the pathogens are developing very severe resistance. And so I think that is a killer app because it's a green chemistry that degrades in the environment. It's already known to be safe. And we're augmenting it with known products in order to massively, massively improve their efficacy. And the nature of its mode of action, I think, will make it less susceptible to resistance issues. That's one. I'd say that operates largely at a product app level, let's call it. When we talk about killer apps at the platform level, I really am excited about this company, Quercus, I'm involved in, where we're using that generative AI platform for bespoke mini protein design. I think that's immensely powerful. We're just at the very, very tip of the iceberg for what is going to be possible there. And there's 2 or 3 others. I mean, I'm involved in a company where we produce natural liquid rubber in the leaves of sunflowers, which is super cool. Another one that's a bioinoculant company that is taking a very, very different approach to inoculants that promote crop health in pulse crops in the northern plains and Canada and the upper Midwest. I'm very excited about that. So it's a handful of ones, but mostly on the input side. And then, one on the biomaterial side.
Let's talk about AI some more. We keep circling it. I feel like we need to really dive in to get more views for this podcast. Joking, but yeah, it's everybody needs to be AI focused now. But it's so from you, I gather it is really one of the driving forces in the Agtech space right now. You mentioned having a digital twin of crops and making faster design cycles. You mentioned about designing new proteins. So I'm just really curious, like how far along are we on the curve of AI here, and how much more exponential is it going to get in accelerating the development of new crops and all of that?
Yeah, I actually don't think we're very far, to be honest. I've been fortunate to be a part of two projects that are anchored in AI. One on the plant breeding, and like you said, one on the crop protection. But really, to be perfectly honest, the reason my friend and colleague John and I founded Quercus was because there wasn't any, and I don't think there is truly any in ag. We licensed the technology from a human medicine focused company. And we only went to human medicine because we couldn't find anything that looked like it in ag. And quite frankly, to get 10 or 20 or $30 million of investment to build a de novo platform in ag, I think it'd be a fool's errand. I don't think we'd ever have gotten the capital to do that. So I actually don't think we're very far. But here's the fun part, is that usually ag will always be like famously 10 or 20 years behind like broader life sciences, biotech, human health, right? I actually think that AI, especially what I'm seeing right now, is moving so fast, and the regulatory regime is favorable enough for these biological solutions. So this movement of chemistry to biology, that I actually think that in the next 5 to 10 years, the innovations in ag AI oriented, will actually outpace human medicine. I think we're going to see more on the market from ag that really matter, products that really, really matter, than we will like an AI fill in the blank, designed monoclonal antibody or something, for disease, because you still have to go through the same regulatory regime for a drug. It's still many, many, many years. It's very, very expensive. Usually companies are built on one or two, ultimate product opportunities. In agriculture, I used to say, ag, if you think of this funnel, like we're like, this is the top of the funnel, and then you see all these diagrams and pitch decks, and it goes down, and there's like this one thing at the bottom. It's your magic golden egg, right? In pharmaceutical development, it's like, this why, like you come down to this point, and then the entire company is like, the rest of the company is built on this binary outcome. And you could have had this like really wicked cool platform, but if you like chose the one wrong thing, then you could be a 0 and not a 1. But in agriculture, it's like this V, like you can put more stuff in up here. Nobody cares if you kill plants. Like people really care if you kill like lots and lots of, non-human primates and humans. Like, do people really care? That's a big deal. Not a good thing. But people don't care if you kill plants. So I can put more things into this funnel, and I can carry more things farther along in my pipeline. You see what I mean? And so I have more shots on goal. They all cost incrementally less. And now with AI, I can move just as fast on the design development stuff. And so my regulatory is quicker. My design development is almost collapsing into one thing. And so I'm immensely optimistic that we're going to make massive strides like in the next 5 years here.
So stay tuned for an imminent AI-driven agricultural revolution.
Yeah, maybe. The question will be, can AI truly integrate field level predictions? That's a thing to watch for. That's where I don't think, this is crazy, but I just don't think enough data exists yet in order to allow for us to understand the environmental factors well enough. Like, yeah, we've got really good weather models. We've got really good things, sensors in the field now. but 99.99% of that is above the ground. And there's a lot going on underneath of the ground. There's billions and billions of microbes and genomes that affect how the plant grows and how it, how it reacts to different stresses and how it binds nutrients and fixes nitrogen and whatever. We understand actually very little. It's like a little bit like it's like neurology and your microbiome in human beings. Like they're fascinating, they're super important, but they're very, very, very complex. And we know relatively nothing about those things as we do maybe the remainder of our bodies and our health. And I think the soil is a lot like that for plants.
I was going to ask, can we use AI to model that? But I'm understanding that we don't understand how it works in the first place, and we need to collect a lot of field data to model it to begin with.
That's right. That's right. I mean, you would imagine in the future that if the data collection becomes tractable, then we could utilize the AI to answer the latter question, right? Which is how it works. But when you've got that amount of soil diversity, that amount of genomic diversity, organismal diversity, and it can be different in every corner of a field in the same soil type. And now you've got, all the soil types in the United States. And so the data become just almost incomprehensibly large. And that's exactly what quantum and next scale genomics technologies and AI are going to help us unlock. But I mean, we're not going to be there for a minute. That's going to take some time.
Sounds like a very similar bottleneck that human biotech has. A lot of people are very excited about AI, but we just don't understand how many of those systems in the human body work in the first place, and we need to collect physical data to model it.
I agree, yeah. And I think we all have to have confidence that our ability to acquire the data will come, and the reliance then on AI could be really fascinating and go much faster than we otherwise would have ever been able to achieve. But the data acquisition systems and ultimately the data ownership, which is where I think a lot of this value will be derived. That's the crux of value creation.
Okay, so we have got data as one of the bottlenecks, and then you also mentioned adoption that's lagging and funding, I guess. So it is definitely true that Agtech is nowhere near as hot as biotech when it comes to funding. Actually, what is the reason for this? And also, do you think it's plausible that we will get the kind of defense tech moment in agriculture when it goes from like being monopolized or oligopolized and slow and not very prone to innovation to like suddenly being super hot, which somehow happened in defense recently?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I hate to, again, sound so pessimistic. I don't think so, given the current paradigm. I don't think that it would be unreasonable, however, for a non-agriculture incumbent that has a lot of money, think big tech, big insurance. Would it be, a lot of these things get solved with money. That's kind of my main point here. But, if you invest, one nickel at a time in these very little things, don't get me wrong. I think that there's some great returns to be made, but there's not an audience of companies out there buying other companies in ag tech for billions of dollars. It's just not happening. And that's not because they're, mean or dumb. They're actually really smart and savvy. They as an oligopoly have never really been forced to pay, more than a couple few $100 million for something that adds value to them. And I don't think that's going to change, frankly. And so I think that ag tech and ag biotech will be forced for the foreseeable future, unless they have a truly disruptive technology, to raise less and do more with less. I think that's a paradigm we're going to live in for a little while. But that doesn't mean that, I was talking about this 3 or 4 months ago, and I said, we haven't talked about Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods for a while. But when that happened, it was all the rage. Everybody was talking about that. And you're like, wow, is Amazon going to become a food company? And what if Amazon becomes a food company? I would say, like, well, what if Intel or IBM becomes a health company? Or what if, Aetna or United Health becomes an agriculture company? Those are the kinds of things where you're like, wow, could the incentives line up enough such that somebody, would be willing to put the pieces together, to put the puzzle together in a different way, to break it apart and put it together a different way? You look at organizations like Berkshire Hathaway sitting on $300 or $400 billion of capital. If Warren Buffett or his successor decided they wanted to come in and reorganize the way that some of this works, they could do it. I mean, they could afford to do it. But there's probably, less than 20 or 30 companies in the world who could. So yeah, that's the outside influence. That's a possibility. But on the very other end of the spectrum, you've got these little itty bitty companies that are trying to create value that make largely incremental change. There are a few that I think are maybe disruptive, but
It's national security an angle or a potential catalyst? I know you're involved in a company that's trying to create domestic rubber production. So why is this important? And is it potentially important enough to really change things for agriculture?
it could be a shining ray of hope. Yeah, actually, it's a terrific observation. I think that national security, nutrition security, national security, healthcare security. I think these things can be linked in ways that we don't yet appreciate. As much calories as we produce, we still depend on other countries a lot for food, right? We still have globally the worst health outcomes per dollar spent of any country, I think, in the world, which is mind-boggling, but true. And does that become a national weakness? I mean, in some ways it already is, and maybe is an unrecognized threat to national security. But certainly, who's going to put the attention to it? I don't know. I think you see me shrug, because I think at some level I have such little confidence that the government is going to make the right kinds of changes. There's an administration who I think talked a big talk on making some of these kinds of changes, albeit many of them not very scientifically oriented, unfortunately. But some of them, the rhetoric was exactly right about the unhealthiness of our citizens and how we ought to be investing in this more thoughtfully and so forth and so on. But then you look at what the policies reflect, and it's the same old, same old. It's the incentivization of a commodity system, and it's continuing to perpetuate itself. So are our legislators and our executive branch actually going to make those kinds of changes? I don't know. I'm more of a private sector believer than I am a public sector believer.
So you don't believe in a Manhattan Project for agriculture, but you're saying maybe we're going to get the next Jeff Bezos, who doesn't make space his big pet project focus, but decides to just go and absolutely disrupt agriculture, and that could be it.
Mm-hmm. That sounds, yes, absolutely. And a lot more likely, in my opinion.
That would be fascinating. I wonder what would be like all the downstream consequences of that. I think most people don't think about this at all, but that would probably change a lot of things in our lives.
It really would. And I tell you, it would create a ripple effect through a lot of things that we as a country have always valued and should continue to value. Like I said, education. I mean, if your children are not being nourished properly, they're not learning properly. And if they're not learning properly, they're not adding the kind of value to society that we all would hope, not just we as citizens, but we as parents, right? So these things are all linked, and I think they'll grow with us as our population matures. And I mean, unfortunately, I don't think we're headed necessarily in many parts of our society in the right direction there, but the opportunity exists. And yeah, the last point, I guess, is on that. I do have more faith in a private sector solution.
I don't disagree with you. And I guess we just talked about resistance from the government and resistance from the incumbents. And you mentioned there is demand or will from the consumers. But just to kind of poke into that a little bit more, you spoke about gene editing and GMO. There has been a lot of fear and FUD around that from consumers. So is that an issue? Is that a blocker as well? And how do we square this with the growing movement for like quote unquote natural, organic, and very like anti-technology even sentiment, I would say.
Right. Well, so when you think about GMO technology, what people tend to not understand, first and foremost, and I'm going to not go straight at nutrition, but I'll go first at climate and climate smart agriculture. If you don't have things like herbicides, that kill weeds, farmers, there is no-till. No-till was regenerative agriculture before regenerative agriculture was cool, right? And farmers, many farmers have taken care of their ground in ways that are very environmentally thoughtful and preserve carbon in the soil and help with soil health, and because they know that this affects directly the yield of their crops and therefore their profitability and other things. When you take away technologies like herbicides, there is no, you have to, like, you plow the weeds under like you probably did 50 years ago, right? So when you think about crops that are grown out in the field that are GMO and then resistant to herbicides, those herbicides come in and they kill all the nasty weeds that prevent these crops from growing. And that makes for a much more productive, environmentally actually safe system. And so it's very, I think, underappreciated by the average consumer that GM technology has been one of the best things for climate smart agriculture, if not maybe the best thing for climate smart agriculture since the 90s, since the 80s and 90s when this technology was first invented. Now, the question then becomes, okay, well, do we need it today? And I think, yes, arguably you do, but the latitude that we have with other technologies has become wider and greater. And so we can do more, we can do things with gene editing and CRISPR technologies that use endogenous DNA today that 20 or 30 years ago we wouldn't have fathomed being able to do using, there wasn't gene editing, not the way that we think about it in today's terms. And so is it a good technology? Absolutely. It's a great technology. Is it a safe technology? Yeah, I think it is, because it's also one of the most heavily regulated technologies in the world. Does that mean that it's worthwhile to develop from an economic standpoint? Oftentimes, no. I mean, take that rubber project. We were funded by the government for multi-million dollars of grants to do a biotech-based GM transformation of sunflowers in order to boost natural rubber production to possibly create a domestic supply. It's a critical resource. We don't produce any of it in North America. And so when we looked at, oh my gosh, we were able to get this to work, well, then you turn to this sort of techno-economic analysis and you go, I'm never going to do this. This is going to take me 10 years and $100 million. I'm never going to do this. So what do? You shift your gears to look at, how can I institute these kinds of genetic and genomic changes that enhance the ability for the plant to make this critical biomaterial, but don't necessarily need to use exogenous DNA? And how do I use accelerated breeding and AI digital twin technology to create a better chassis to produce this biomaterial? And I think it's those kinds of answers that are coming out today for not just like producing new novel biomaterials or nutritional profiles, but it's also coming out, like I said, in the crop inputs arena, where maybe I don't need to create a GMO plant. Maybe I can design an herbicide that kills just this plant, right? Because I have that degree of precision that's enabled through fill in the blank, gene editing, AI, what have you, right? So I think there's this convergence of enabling tech that's allowing us to sort of go, like, why fight? Like, I don't want to fight over it. Yeah, it's like I'd rather just do the coolest thing that's cheapest, fastest. So anyway, that's where I think we're headed.
So it can be an incredibly useful tool in the right context, but it's not a all-round solution to all the problems in agriculture. And you're saying it's better to be creative and to look at each problem individually and figure out what's the best tech stack.
That's exactly right, especially to the extent that we're eating the thing and you need to go convince the moms and what have you that are buying, the millennial moms that are buying the stuff for their kids, right? They just rather, maybe they don't like it. Maybe it's irrational. Okay, whatever. Like maybe I can come up with a different solution for you and it's all the same. I mean, there are other things that we produce societally that we all consume every day, every day in our everyday lives that are GMO. There's a gene that's stuck into a yeast cell, that's stuck into E. coli or whatever, and it produces all kinds of really wonderful things like in our laundry detergent and our medicines. But people don't look at it the same way. I don't know why, but it's very valuable technology.
It's crazy how much people fixate on labels, like GMO, suddenly everything GMO is the worst thing in the world. I mean, same things with vaccines, like people start having some questions of some very minor side effects of one particular vaccine in one context, and then suddenly like, all of vaccines are bad and cause autism and whatnot.
And now we're going to get measles again. I mean, like, come on, give me a break. So that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, but whatever.
You are saying basically, it's hard to educate the consumers. Don't bother. Let's just design around and to those preferences instead.
I think to the extent you can, and maybe I'm just old and tired and I have a lot of scar tissue. I think if you'd have asked me this question 10 years ago, I probably would have pounded the table with an ideological view that, we're all going to educate the consumer and whatever. But there are well-funded campaigns out there that make money paying extremists to dig up crops that help cure blind children. I mean, these are terrorists in the nth degree. And like, I don't think any consumer education effort's going to, overcome the weird, bizarre desires against, like what you said, a label. And so, to the extent that we can be creative in the meantime, and hopefully the next generation is a little more sensible about it, maybe we'll wait it out, I guess. I'll probably be gone by then, but anyway.
All right. So to tie all of this back together, I feel like on one hand, you have painted a pretty bleak picture. There is a lot of forces that are against solving a lot of the challenges and against innovation in crops, in agriculture. We have got incumbents. We have got, a lot of consumer preferences that are not the most rational. We have got a lot of lack of government funding or like right prioritization as well. But I gather that there are some real glimmers of hope in terms of these, like more individualized consumer preferences and AI and some other technologies that might eventually win the day over time. Is that like the most optimistic scenario, or what's like, just to paint the opposite, like what would it look like?
No. I think you were right. I was following you completely right up until you said might save the day. If we want to be optimistic, we'll say that they will save the day. They will eventually save the day. Indeed.
just to wrap this all up, like, yeah, what would the most bullish, optimistic scenario look like where we can be in, let's say, 20 years from now, if everything works out?
I really think that it'll involve healthcare. I really strongly believe it. And I think in 20 years, the most bullish outcome is we as a society have come to appreciate the inescapable linkage between what we put in our bodies and what our health, longevity, performance as human beings is. I'm sure it's invariably linked to happiness, mental health. There's so many things around this that I think if we in 20 years have done what I hope we'll do with research and data acquisition to truly appreciate the linkages between nutrition and what agriculture can bring into food and the healthcare system writ large, I think that that'll be the outcome that we could only hope for. And obviously, I hope for this, in the United States, but I also hope for it in the developing world, where, to be frank, some of these mistakes of quantity over quality have not persisted for decades. It's almost like the cell phone examples in Africa. Nobody has a phone line. Why build a phone line when digital infrastructure and wireless came out? Just skip over that and go straight to a cellular infrastructure, a mobile infrastructure. I hope that in the developing world, the same thing will happen with food and healthcare systems. That they'll skip over the quantity dilemma and go straight into what is sensible, for nutrition overall.
Maybe the Brian Johnson cult will create like their own blue zone, not like tied to geography, but their own like virtual blue zone, and that trickles down to the wider population.
I like it. Yeah, deployable. Yeah.
I think that's a good, optimistic, hopeful note to end on, unless there are any other parting thoughts that you want to share with our audience.
No, I think you've done a great job. We've covered a lot of ground. I appreciate the candid exchange, and I think you did very well, like, to wrap us up on the optimistic high note. So I'm eager to see what these systems will bring. I'm happy to be a part of it, and I really do think that while the ag and food system has struggled and currently, frankly, isn't in a terrific cycle, I do think that, from an investment perspective and an impact perspective, there really isn't any other sector, that I want to be involved in. And, I hope people continue to find it attractive at many levels.
Yeah, it's probably not the sector that most like 21-year-old founders with a laptop or a lab bench even think about, like, oh, this is the hot thing I want to go disrupt.
Until they taste the perfect tomato.
We need to get perfect tomatoes into the hands of more young techies, I guess.
Isn't that true? Well, thank you again for having me. I'm